Hi, and welcome everyone. It's great to have all of you on board today. This is the regular meeting of the research group within the African Forum for Primary Health Care. And today we're going to be discussing developing research question. And I think it's probably the most important and most difficult problem. The next two are also part of that challenge, the next two sessions. How do we actually go from, having this notion of, I'd love to do some research and we understand where primary care is all about and we find a nice topic. Problem is that turning a topic into a question is challenging. And we're going to go through the rest of it, of this few slides to help you understand how to begin that process. But the process doesn't end with today. So what we're going to do is also go through in the next session how you look for literature. I'm going to give you some very, very basic something to help you to refine your question in the discussion groups we're going to have just now, that you actually have some way of checking the literature more comprehensively. And then the third problem is going to be the third meeting after this, is how do you turn those research questions into research objectives? And the aim is not as important because usually it brings the objectives together, but the clear problem is how do you turn research questions into objectives? And in fact, how do you go back and then refine the question through the literature, coming back to the objectives? And so it goes round and round. And I think don't expect to have a finalized set of research questions, so to say, fixed today. It's the beginning, and you need to be aware of that process as being very iterative. So welcome. If you can, we're not going to do introductions, so feel free, like Dr. Adiraje, to put in your introductions into the chat section so that we get to know each other. I think we will do that in the group sessions. You'll get to know each other. But we don't have enough time to go through the group right now and do too many introductions. So let's get straight into this question of how do you develop a research question. So for today, I just want to mention that broadly, I'm going to go through this research question issue. Then Anna Dania from Netherlands is going to talk about PBRNs. I think she may have joined us already. If you have, Anna, just feel free to put your hand up, but she may join us a little bit. And then we're going to go into some reports briefly around the question of the African Population Cohort Consortium and the e-health study that we're busy with. And as we're going along, we are going to be focusing, especially in the research questions, around the question of what kind of research can we do also, as we're thinking about the research question. What kind of research can we do using the platform that is available, which is the AfroPHC meetings here, and the number of people that are available in the research group, and even the research, the AfroPHC more broadly. Who are they, and how does one actually find ways to use them as an informed group? And then we'll go into, looking at their practices where they can collect data in their settings. And then the third one is to do population level data collection. So I think this is just a bigger idea, and we'll talk to that briefly at the end for today. So today I want to just say that you are sitting with a research question, and I could share with you, and I think I should, so that in a way you can get a sense of the kind of questions that some of the people have come up with in the, and I'm going to just do that very quickly, where we have already asked people who are part of the mentorship program to share with us their questions. So just quickly. And I'm going to just go across, and we'll just go through this very briefly. All right, give me a second. So what you have in yellow is questions that various researchers have asked. And you'll find that when we are going to break up the groups, some of you have actually put your questions out here. And that's great because you need to have something to start with. It may not be the sort of be all end all, the only one that you'll ever do, or that is not as important as trying to get somewhere. So yes, if you put up something like this, which is challenges faced by young nurses, you'll find that is not a very good begin in terms, or a good research question. But the fact that you put that versus nothing is much more valuable. At least now somebody talking to you will ask questions. What do you mean by challenges? And what do you mean by young nurses? And what do you mean by clinical mentorship? And this is a real problem in the group. What do you mean? What exactly do you think you want to ask when you say challenges? And then frame it. Maybe it's what are the challenges faced by young nurses in clinical mentorship? So we'll go through some of that. But the way in which you started is it's a digging in. And that question, what do you mean, is something that you need to ask quite regularly in the group discussions. What do you mean? What exactly do you mean? Can you break it down a little bit more in terms of what you really want to ask? And that is, we'll come to later. Well, here's some simpler models. And, one that I learned, many years ago was this FINER model, which is, just stands for feasible, which is manageable. Can you work it? And we'll come to the question of how you put that together. Interesting, novel or new, ethical, relevant. Now, I find that in a way, this question of, sorry, let me stop sharing those questions and get to the slide. So this is the slides, developing a research question, the FINER model. So you've got, as I mentioned, feasible, interesting, novel, new, ethical, relevant. So that's a useful model. And we'll put all these up on the website, on the webpage, so you can pick them up, so don't stress. I think you can write notes, but important to reflect on what I'm saying and highlight them beforehand or afterwards. So FINER, I think, more adapted. I find that feasible is actually, as you get to be a more accomplished researcher, you start picking up questions quite quickly. You sort of think of questions easily around you, and you can define them well, and you do them well. And then what tends to drive you is, that's easy. I could do that. I can see the manageability. I can see the feasibility of it. But that's not a very good place to start when you are like many of you might be as novice researchers. You've not done much, or you've not done anything. This should become the last thing. So don't try to fit something that has worked somewhere else and just try to adapt it. Although that's not a bad thing too, because we all, research is like creativity. It is creativity. And we all learn how to paint by painting, copying somebody else's painting, or writing something by kind of copying somebody else, using their style, seeing things and say, I can write similarly, and then try to do that. When you do that, you find yourself building confidence, and then you can see, I could do it slightly differently here and there, etc. And that's how you will build out yourself. So we are not going to be talking about the feasibility too quickly now, because feasibility only comes right when you are better familiar with methodologies. We'll come back to that question a little bit later. Now, we're taking the first session, giving you a broad idea about research and what that means. It might have been all over the show, but now I'm saying take a question, an area, and let's break it down. So firstly, you must ask yourself, is it interesting? And this really sounds like a silly question, but it's really important. Sometimes if you're going to do this research, it could take your time for 2 years. And if you're not thinking about whether that really drives you, you'll find yourself getting bored with the topic. It's not really that useful. It's not that interesting anymore. We'll come back to that question. The area must be interesting, but your research doesn't need to be always interesting, can become boring, but the area interests you. You can also ask at the same time, and in a way, we often tend to mix up these two. We have personal interests, but we're often driven by, oh, I want to, publish something that everybody will notice. So we want to make it very relevant, and in fact, sometimes too relevant. We want to have our, lead research somehow hit the front pages of the newspaper. And I can tell you now, don't plan that. You can make it relevant, but don't plan to be somehow make a splash with your first ever piece of research. That's not how you're going to splash papers. You're going to splash it by doing research in a relevant area over years. And maybe after a while, you'll be able to, influence front pages. But don't get yourself thinking you'll change the world. In fact, you will change the world brick by brick, change the way things work, but never the whole wall, and get real about that. So novel is something that is useful. You think through that because you want to make something new. And in Africa, there's a lot of things that are new. So it's not hard to find things that are new. But generally in the world, new is not the master's level research. An honors and a master's level research is not expected to be new. It could be another thing done somewhere else that is done in Africa. People do like new because they don't want something that is not going to be of use and add value. But master's level is not such an issue. But if you're doing a PhD, you have to be new. But again, it's not that difficult in Africa because there's so much that is not dealt with in Africa. Even if you take things from elsewhere, the way you do it and what you do in Africa just gives a whole different story. So the question is, how do you tell what's new and what's novel? Well, that's the literature. You've got to look, you've got to see what's done before you start saying, oh, I've got this research question. You got to ask yourself, and that's what you're going to do today is, well, actually, what's the literature telling you right now? Where does it sit? So that question you're going to ask is either, is it something that, is done already? What is being done? And then the other is the question of, is it something that, or what do you mean by it? What exactly do you mean? Because when you look at the literature, that's where you're going to come undone. So relevance interest is nice, it's there. Feasible, manageable, you'll think about it later and we'll talk to it. Novel and new is really the literature and you're thinking about it carefully and the meaning. And then ethical is just generally some people do some really crazy stuff, not thinking about the ethical challenges. Sometimes they want to do work with children or they want to ask questions that can be very difficult to deal with, or they don't know where that, their limits lie in terms of the kind of methodologies, etc. But generally, you must ask yourself, especially problems with collecting data amongst children or collecting data that requires tissue sampling or patient interventions or, drugs, any intervention, etc. So you need to be careful about some of that. But when we get to simple processes, it's not that difficult. So the ethical challenges are fairly limited. The big question, and I kind of come to that, when you get to good research questions, is that it is focused. In other words, it's really, you've had to ask yourself this question, what do I mean? Are you, what's the literature say? And you go round and round until what you started off with, what are the challenges, might be broken down a bit more, where you're saying, what are the challenges during clinical mentorship in these? So you might have a bit more information that you say, well, actually, I saw some of the literature says this, literature says that. There's a qualitative piece of work and there's a quantitative piece of work. And you sit and you're tossing around, how do I actually navigate trying to build that focus? Now, you also don't want to be having yes or no questions. Questions need to have some depth. You can't ask one question, is everybody, in Africa, got COVID? Yes, no. But that's not really very helpful if you're asking very simplistic yes, no questions. So you've got to think about some depth. I mean, as an example, when you are asking, let's say, a survey questionnaire, you've got to have somewhere between 15 to 30 fields of data collection. You can't go and do a piece of research with just 5, depending on what the work is about. But generally, in masters, it'd be a bit challenging to do that. But that's just some ideas. Many a time people put too much, and that I think is the bigger problem than too little. So again, SMART is something that's useful. You need to have it. Focused means that clear. Is it clear what it says? And is it concise, short? because many a time people have these long-winded statements that they say it's a question when it's actually multiple questions. And so you've got to really bring it down and say, ask each one properly. And then you've got to decide, am I asking all of them, or is there subsections to the one? And that's how you build in the focus. So be specific. I think a lot of times people go on a fishing expedition. They don't know what the literature says. And so they just come up with questions sucking thumbs, and that's not okay. Just saying, well, there's nothing that I think is available, and you shouldn't be doing that. Of course, fishing expedition, you can have broad questions where you find that data is not available in the literature. We'll talk to that question and how you might go more qualitatively versus quantitatively. And that's the difference where you might go not on a fishing expedition, but with open-ended questions where you've not got that information at all in the literature. So you go a little bit widely with open-ended question. But then again, you've got to be very thoughtful about the question. You can't have very, very broad questions, but people don't understand. Then you are on a fishing expedition, even in that kind of expert or not in-depth interview, as an example. You've got to be clear. You've got to have your idea of what it is you want to investigate. You must also be measurable. Now, this might be more measurable in terms of quantitative stuff. So you must look at, whether there's, if you want to do that, we'll get to that question. Attainable is something like, is it doable? Is it achievable? Realistic, again, can be done in a reasonable time, but also is it realistic in terms of what is possible, given, what you have available? Timely is just, is it new? So again, similar ideas, but I think the idea of specific is really important. Be focused. That's really the key word that you need to focus on. So focus is what we're going to do. And, you might find that this is not something that you can teach. You can only do it when you do it. And so you start off with a question. Your process in terms of today will be looking at the literature, coming back to the question, but in a way, when we get to the literature, objectives will become part of that problem, where each of your questions, depending on your question, may translate to becoming the objective. So your question might be, what are the challenges of what was that question we came across? What are the challenges faced by young nurses in clinical mentorship? So your actual objective will be, and depending, of course, on what you find in the literature and what you've thought about the question, and you see, well, actually, there's very little data out there. And so I will go towards asking qualitative questions because of certain challenges with perhaps quantitative data. And then you might say, well, let me describe the challenges of nurses in their clinical mentorship, the challenges faced. So your question becomes, what are, to the question of describe. Now, I'll come to this question. You might actually, of this question of how do you tailor questions to your methodology, but you might go into the literature and you might say, oh, there's actually a very nice questionnaire, or maybe a couple of questionnaires, which have been developed in parts of the world, some low middle income countries, where this questionnaire is basically going through a whole list of challenges in clinical mentorship, and that has been done with nurses. But you see only one study done or nothing done in young nurses. Well, you might say, well, I'd actually like to use that because I can see that it addresses lots of those issues. And the key question in the survey process, is that validated? In other words, is it validated to use in the world? And then you might raise the question, is it validated to use? Validated means, is it reliable? Is it valid in the sense that the construct usually is the challenge? Concept and construct validity, the way in which the language is discussed, the way they use the language, does it actually apply in Africa? So, for example, there's some tools that talk to, where the language is very high. It's something if you put into a South African setting, the nurses might not understand what is meant by some of those words, because that was done in Canada. So you have to look at these problems that come with there. But you might land up saying, well, the challenges are basically work challenges, challenges with, recreation, and challenges with supervisors. So you might have to then go and say, well, actually, there's a lot of stuff on challenges relating to clinical mentorship. And there already is work on that. So you've got to go back to your question and say, well, actually, it's not what are the challenges. You've got to say, well, what are the challenges of work in clinical mentorship? And then you've got to have literature that speaks to that question, because you found literature that speaks to that question. So you've got to deliberate on that question, and you are maybe focusing more if you're qualitative, or you're just going because there's literature available. So you're looking at the little bits now more. Work situation, the challenges of work situation is one question. The challenges of supervisors in clinical mentorship is another challenge. The challenges of living or life or recreation is another problem. And you have got to go to the literature and actually see what else has there been found, and argue the case that you want to understand the challenges of those three elements, or the element each one by one, and that is going to matter. Why does it matter? And those become your objectives, which you might say, well, let's describe, which is usually the easier one. So description is basically something that you do in both qualitative and quantitative. But importantly is this is a spiral. It goes round and round, and you're going to go round and round and get really tired, but this is the hardship. So if you get the hang of this, you're on the way to getting to be a good researcher. But if it's hard, you'll still get to do it, provided you've got a good supervisor that helps you. And often at time we start at big and exciting, but really where we need to go is focused and boring. And boring, I say, the research should become something, the actual project should become something that, this is just a simple process, simple thing. Well, if it's simple thing, that's really where you want to be. So let's look at the question of methods. And I've just got to be aware of time. Yeah, I think I'll overstate my time. So basically, as I mentioned before, you've got two different types of method broadly. And I think that we don't want you to get tangled in too much of different types of methodologies. We're going to come to that later, and that I think too, probably next year, to kind of go into paradigmatic issues, etc. But right now, this is teaching you to be a novice researcher. And so you need to look at what types of broad research are available. So qualitative is really about words. Many a time, the way in which we collect things is mostly words. Either it's usually spoken words, sometimes it's written words that we then capture and then we analyze. And that usually is, a sort of simple approach that thematizes it. So you've got to look at the way in which you capture that information, usually with words. And the challenge is that in the literature, you have not found any clear ideas. It's in that absence of ideas that you say, let me look at describing it more qualitatively, because there is nothing actually available. Like, for example, what is the, and you've got to obviously look at the literature before you can say. So I'm going to really suck my thumb and say, what is the experience of young boys in Africa with playing marbles? I don't think there's any research, but can you get any literature? There's nothing. You find that there's nothing in the world, even in the world that you can find. So really, you want to get this experience and the playing of marbles by young boys. So how do you start that? You've got to start with ideas. That is at least the base to start with. And also there's sometimes when starting with words, even if you've got the numbers, a lot of literature about it, the way in which it's understood globally may not be helpful. And you might say, no, that's actually not very useful in our context. And so I'm going to go with qualitative. And usually the questions, it's an exploration and you're asking how and what questions, because you don't have anything. Usually that's what defines it. And that's usually a research question. On the quantitative side, you can be also describing, usually it's numbers. It's about where I have some numbers. You can't do quantitative with words. Both of these things you can do with pictures, you can do with map data, you can do, well, more quantitative with map data, but you can do things. You can even do it with even with qualitative if you want to get the experience of people of a geography example. But the quantitative, the numbers is usually what you need to find. But this, and most times it's description. And things that can be simply describing them using basic statistics, even available within Excel. You don't even need to have to go to a fancy statistics software. When you are looking at comparing, even that can be done in Excel, but generally when you're comparing, looking at relationships and testing, where you're doing experimental research, that you need to be able to sit and have some sort of statistical software. And there again, you've got to say, am I thinking the problem through, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome? And that I think some of you may not do right now, but I would really put that aside. But that's kind of thinking through when you're looking at comparing it and testing, etc. But usually on this side, you have some ideas because it's breaking. It's a very closed question with numbers that come out of it. And sometimes people mix it up by putting closed questions and some open questions. Even one open question can land up making it a multi-method study. One question, because depending on the answer, you can get a whole lot of stuff coming up. So if you're going to be at the beginning, either go qualitative completely or quantitative completely. Do not mix the two. You'll mix your brain up. And usually in that setting, you're coming up with a proposition. A hypothesis is, I know, but I would like to see, I think I know, I really have a conviction that I know this will happen. And I want to test to see if it happens. A proposition is actually, I think I know, I don't really have strong ideas around it, but there is a thing that I think I could describe, a relationship or a comparison. And that's where you call a proposition. So hypothesis is only if you're doing a strict testing study. Okay, but usually quantitatively, it's a research proposition, not a research question. So other issues I just want to mention very briefly before I shut down and let Dr. Dania talk, is that we will come later to these question of paradigms. And paradigms, people will be talking about, participatory action research and a whole lot of other types of research. It is an extension of the qualitative methodology, but to me, it's really strongly about how you as a researcher fit in. And in some ways, the methodology of quantitative versus qualitative brings that up, where qualitative researchers say that many a times the way in which you structure your quantitative research is assuming a lot of things. And so you ask these questions, get back, something that what you think is right, but in fact, people have to answer it the best way they could. So it answers sometimes your own prejudices. And, it's garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't think about that carefully and you really structure your questionnaire and the arguments around it strongly around the literature, your strong bias that can creep in there. And so the people in the qualitative side said, usually lots of the quantitative research is actually poor because it's not valid because the questions themselves were prejudicial. So just think about that in terms of methodologies. And then sometimes people have even said, well, you know what, even in qualitative research where I go in and ask very respectful, open-ended questions, I can still be not really giving the research participant the power to be part of this process. And so it's more about the relationship we have with the participants that's a paradigm challenge. So design, on the other hand, is more about exactly how you structure your particular study. What are you exactly doing? Sometimes people say method design, but that's your design. What am I going to actually do, in terms of the study? So it's important to keep these three things somewhat separate and have paragraphs that spell it out. Literature review, I'm going to just share with you briefly after this, Google Scholar, and I'll do some examples where, you can just start with Google Scholar. Google Scholar is not by any means the only way. It does produce a lot, very useful. It's good for people who don't have access to other databases. And you just need to go about it, some simple searching. And in fact, we can do that just now. Questionnaires, I've mentioned before, you need to have them validated. So we're going to come back to these examples. I'm going to just see if we've got our Anna Dania here. So Anna, welcome. Let me just make you co-host. And I'll just share Anna's, and there's some questions. Perhaps we can take those questions. They're not too many. Anna, is that all right?
Yes, thanks. Yes, I'm here.
Anna, I think you're muted. Perhaps let's just unmute you.
I'm not muted, no. Do you hear me?
There you go. Oh, sorry. I've not got my earpiece. Sorry, I heard you. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm here. I can start a little bit later.
Yes,
please.
let me pull up yours and then we will. Okay. All right, let's take these two questions and then I'll share screen. So let's start with Ellie. Go ahead, Ellie. If you can unmute yourself, then Dr. Adirije.
Oui, merci beaucoup, prof, pour la parole. Je crois comme il y a je vais parler
Ellie,
en français.
before you go, let me before you go, Ellie, just one sec. Can I emphasize to everyone, please? You should be getting a translation. So go to your interpretation at the bottom, and please select English if you are, so that Ellie speaks in French and you can understand in English. So all of you just go and select that, and then Alexandra will do that. Go ahead.
OK.
Ellie, go ahead, Ellie.
OK.
You can speak in French.
Merci. Je disais, comme Alexandra est là, je peux parler en français. Comme ça, elle va traduire pour être beaucoup plus à l'aise. Je suis docteur Elie depuis la RDC. Je suis membre de la coordination exécutive de AfroPHC. Et je suis dans le lead du programme de CPD. Des hypothèses. Et quand on est en train de faire l'étude qui est quantitative, et on va formuler les hypothèses. Est-ce que ces hypothèses vont être basées sur la littérature ou l'expérience dans les domaines? Est-ce que c'est sur la littérature, c'est qu'on a lu d'autres chercheurs, qu'on reformule les hypothèses, ou soit dans l'expérience, c'est le OK. Et puis, j'espère que la présentation sera partagée.
Yeah.
Merci à vous, professeur.
Yeah. Now we'll share the presentation. I strongly advise looking at the readings as well, which is circulated. A hypothesis is a guess, and you want to test an hypothesis. So, for example, a company will say drug A is new on the market. We'd like to test it out. We think it's going to work. Or you might say, I'd like to do a exercise program. Let's say I know based on the literature that a mind, let's say a relaxation technique of 20 minutes does great things for people's blood pressure. So I have an idea. Question is, you've got to go looking at the literature and actually say, let's take that breathing technique because it's a little bit more, something you can relate to. So in primary care, you could do it. So you have to go into the literature and say, well, is there somebody who's done this work? So you start off in the search, and usually work, you would have to start with looking at where experimental work is there. So just simply searching the topic is not enough. You've got to have, firstly, the idea of a review. You've got to ask whether there's a review, systematic review. You might ask for a meta-analysis. So you've got to include that in your search terms. You might even be very clear, much clearer about PICO, the problem, the intervention, your comparator, and your outcomes. So for example, you might say, well, my problem is blood pressure outcomes. My problem is blood pressure and treatment of blood pressure, management of blood pressure. My intervention is, relaxation. My comparator is no relaxation, usual drugs, usual treatment. And my outcome is blood pressure, improvement. So that's your PICO. You then got to go looking at that in the search terms to try and get yourself focused literature. So you're right. You start with an idea, but you can't come with the idea just saying, oh, I think it's going to work. You've got to go looking at the literature. So I hope that answers your question. And I would strongly advise, Ellie, this is not for the I've not done any experimental work, so it's not something that you should be jumping to right away. Start with simple stuff, get your confidence, and I think you'll do that sometime in the future, but don't get too anxious to get there yet. Good. Dr. Adirejay, sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Uzodinma.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. And thank you for the effort to pronounce my father's name well.
Good.
Initially, you got it, but when your speed went up, you also started mixing it up. It is Adirejay.
Adirejay.
Thank you. My name is Uzodinma Adirejay. Let me first appreciate Prof. and AfroPHC for this wonderful work. I listened and I'm trying to think through of the advice to stick to one type of methodology, qualitative or quantitative. And I'm looking at how practicable will it be in a typical research? Does that mean that mixed method is less effective? Or is there a period where it will reach and one can then get back to mixed method? Because actually it's quite difficult to do even any research without having some of qualitative interventions and quantitative, whether you are doing desk review, providing a section report, or looking for information before you get into, even sometimes when you use focal group discussions, you cannot really pinpoint that in quantitative manner. It can also be just qualitative. Where is the gap? Where is the bridge? Where is the margin? Where should one stop and the other start? Or is it to completely rule out mixed methods? Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Adirejay. I think, no, I'm not suggesting that mixed methods not be used. In fact, when you get your PhD, invariably, I would be suggesting you do that. When I say don't mix them, I say don't mix them into one study. Some people do this. They get a questionnaire and they add an open-ended question. Do not put that together. If you're doing it, do that at a later stage when you're more comfortable with both of those types of methodologies. So I would strongly advise, this is the purpose of this group is to try and support, at least for now, to support novel researchers, novice researchers, people who've not done anything. Yes, I would strongly advise when you've not done anything, try and keep strictly to one for a study, take one, get yourself familiar with it, then do the other. Some people also have the notion, and I mean, you must not say, oh, I must become an expert in one and then only I'll try the other. I think it's part of a growing, you'll do that. And some people will tend to like one particular research method. They feel more comfortable with it. It's a personal thing. You have to, but don't get intimidated or think, this is too hard and that's too hard. Get yourself into those and try to do them in small bits in terms of a study, do that one way, learn how to use it properly, and then try another study on a quantitative method. And then later you can then put them two together when you get more competent. Some people tend to think, and I'll do this very briefly, that qualitative is easy because it's just, collecting the information and then, you just thematize it. It's not that easy. In fact, you can really be very strongly confounded. The work comes afterwards when you have to sit and wade through, I've got one PhD candidate who I thought, and this was a PhD candidate, she'd done master's work and she didn't have good style in terms of interviews. So she had a lot of closed questions, too much of an interview schedule that she landed up making closed. And so the quality of the interview was really challenging. But in addition to that, she's got about 100 odd, and that's 100,000 words. And I told her, you got to bring that 100,000 words down to about 2,000. And she started just picking willy-nilly, and you got to have a process. And so it's challenging actually, and you can land up being a mess. Of course, once you get it right, it can work very well, and you can do it very quickly and very well. Same with quantitative. Some people are intimidated. No, don't be intimidated. Go there, start doing it, and again, your work is actually much more beforehand. You've got to really think it through beforehand. Afterwards, it's simpler. But that long work beforehand can really derail you if you're not, if you're not aware that the work is beforehand. Once you've got it figured out, very much easier afterwards. So they have different pros and cons to them. Do not think one is easier than the other. There was somebody else, a Professor, that was here, and I don't know, he's jumped off. more left. Prof. Otiende, you wanted to speak? Go ahead, and then we can give it over to Anya. Prof. Otiende, you okay? You don't need to say anything. If you want to, please go ahead. Okay. I think Prof. Otiende's changed his mind. That's fine. All right. El Hadi, go ahead. Keep it brief, and then we can move to Anna. Go ahead, Anna. Dr. El Hadi, I think you can. Let me just give you the ability to unmute. Go ahead,
Okay.
Dr. El Hadi. Dr. Miski.
Thank you, Prof. Shabir, for
Yes.
the useful and very nice and informative presentations. And I think the debate between qualitative and quantitative research is the continuous talk in many scientific platforms nowadays. But I want to add that quantitative survey questions are used in initial research, defining a research project for the right target audience. However, the qualitative questions are often open-ended and have answered why and gain context about qualitative data and understand how to quantify behaviors. The qualitative methods allow also to explore consent and experience in more details. This, I think, is one of the useful of such research methodology. I think it is good to consider both mixed method, quantitative and qualitative, in some situations, but not always. This can add more values to the research itself. It has an open question and to be answered at the end of the quantitative research as the open question analysis context. Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you. Great stuff. Good. You can share screen as well, Anna, if you feel you want to use it on your side. Thank you all very much. So let me introduce Dr. Anna Dania. She's working on PBRNs across the globe, and she's in Maastricht University at the Netherlands, and she'll talk more about the same question. How do you look at a practice-based research network, similar issues, and how do we get there to in fact prioritize research like that? So let's go for it. Go ahead, Anna.
Good evening, everybody. I had followed the presentation of Dr. Mosa, and I would like to recommend that look at a simple research question, very simple one, that will be a very nice and easy beginning, and also it can give very meaningful outcomes. As you will see in the presentation, I'm going to start immediately. I'm going to inform you about the way that PBRNs are prioritizing, but I think that it is important to remind you that the PBRNs are coalitions of practitioners in the field, in primary care, and academics who have collaborated, who are collaborating to produce research which will have impact on the clinical care and the improvement of healthcare services. Whatever I will speak today, it is somehow designed so it is tailor-made to be connected with the rest ideas which you will be trained today. And I will start with this. The basic rule when we are prioritizing research in practice-based research networks is that research questions must be relevant to primary care settings and the real world events, and also applicable in the primary care settings. That means the research can be doable in the primary care, the topics are appropriate and they are chosen to be applied in the primary care settings. This is a basic rule which is applicable also for your research. When you are looking at research, as you will see in my next slides, you must think what is happening in the real world conditions in your primary care setting. I have planned to present you various ways that academics and practitioners in the field are collaborating for research prioritization and research participation in a practice-based research network. And I will start with that. First of all, we have this academic and academic-driven research, which is otherwise called top-down. In these cases, the academic and experienced researchers bring the research projects or research ideas to BBRN, and the practices and the practitioners, therefore, are asked if they are agreed to participate and only, if they are agreed to participate. And in this case, the practitioners in the field typically contribute only with research data, and they spend the minimal time with research involvement. Then we have the collaborative top-down research, where the academic and experienced researchers discuss the research agenda together, and the academics are empowering the practitioners in the field. And in this case, informative meetings are taking place, and they are used to explore the relevance and applicability of research in the real world conditions. So you see that always the terms relevant and applicable are the key words in primary care research. Then we have the type of collaborative research. That means that the practitioners bring up the study questions which are relevant to their practice, and the researchers bring their research expertise, and together they formulate the research question or hypothesis and design the study to answer the question or test the hypothesis. I guess that the pattern that we are collaborating in this setting here and today is exactly this collaborative style. And we are asked to support you, to bring your research question, to formulate it better, and then test it.
Perhaps just quickly, some people have asked the question, what does PBRN mean? So just to quickly add.
Yeah, I said it from the beginning, and I repeated that PBRN is a coalition of academics and practitioners who have agreed to collaborate in order to conduct research, which will produce clinical relevant outcomes for the primary care or quality improvement of the healthcare services.
Thanks, Anna. Can I just quickly ask you, I'll just give you a minute. I just want to explain this in a way that people here will relate better. We are basically coming together now as people who are just interested in research from Africa. And many of us are sometimes not in practices, or we're just working academia, or we could be in all sorts of different places, students, whatever. But as we're going along, we basically want to try and look at not just helping you to do a piece of research, but for you to do sometimes your research with this network, which is just good research and using the network. But the network is of the people. So in other words, saying, okay, let's go through and get all the people today to be part of, let's say focus groups, or maybe part of a questionnaire. But these are now participants. We are becoming participants in the research that somebody designed. Now, what Anna is talking about as practice-based research network is not us being the participants, but us being part of the research team. In what we do is now, not all of you are going to do that, but those of you who are sitting, let's say in a clinic or in a place that in primary care that's suitable for us to develop a practice-based research network, we may say, if you would like to, and you've got a practice and we'll have to define that practice, you then say, oh, I don't mind being part of that. Now, then we become a practice-based research network. So like Anna is talking about, it requires a mix of people who are going to be, people who are in practice. They're not always researchers. They're not academics. We also need academics who are not necessarily part of that practice, but who have research skills to come together and then look at how to do this. So I think that hopefully helps you to understand, because the group is relatively new and kind of very disparate, Anna. So just to help them contextualize it from their own pathway. Is that all right? Thanks.
Yeah,
You can carry on. I think you've given some really useful
Thank you very
ideas.
much for these clarifications. And I would like to say that thinking about your group, I was thinking that the collaborative model that I just mentioned before, which brings the practitioners and the academics together, and the practitioners bring their study questions, or the students bring their study questions, and the researchers, the experienced researchers, support them to conduct their research, is a startup step, let's say, like that.
Very much.
Here we have the case of bottom-up networks, where the topics are derived from the direct input of primary care practitioners, and they are aligned fully to their interests and the complexity of the patient care in the community settings, in primary care settings. And the practitioners in this bottom-up research prioritization are empowered through training and mentoring from the experienced researchers or academics, and the opinions in this case are valued strongly. That means they are the propeller of this research. And the experienced researchers are used mainly to refine the research questions and protocols, and not to impact strongly what will be the research. Before Sabir mentioned some ideas, and I would like to speak about other types of research prioritization, because this can give you a better insight. We can have a research prioritization by democratic vote. That means that the members of a network, they are voting about what they would like to do as a research and develop the research agenda as such. Then we could have a network, a practice-based research network, which has special interest groups, such as groups that are addressing to specific health conditions, as I said here, arthritis, or diabetes, or cardiovascular, or obesity, or smoking cessation, and so forth. And then there can be networks who are specialized, the whole network specialized in minority populations or underserved populations or child health and so forth. Then we have a category of community-based networks, which are the most bottom-up type of networks, where the practitioners in the field are and the community are on the same side. I don't know if you are acquainted of this idea. It is very common in the bottom-up networks in America. They are there, and the community is represented by community advisory boards, or the experts, the expert part of the network is subcontractors of the community group, and the community group is the basis of the network. Community group meaning the patients, the special, let's say tribe group, like, for example, the Aboriginals in Australia, the indigenous people in America, and so forth. Then we have another category, which is entirely, let's say, top-down directed, is the data-driven agenda. Typical data-driven agenda is made, for example, when we have big studies of comparative effectiveness research. where the practices, the policymakers, and the funders are agreeing that, that this research is very necessary. But this is a very advanced, let's say, step for a PBRN. I want to emphasize on the barriers to engage practitioners in the field in a PBRN activity, because these barriers may be met also in your research case. When you go to a practice and you ask for, let's say, data contribution, the practice may refuse because they say that there is competing priorities. We have a very tight workflow in the practice, or the we have time limitations. Our research cannot, your research cannot hinder our practice, and so forth. These are basic obstacles when the people are gathering data. Then another part which we are trying to resolve with this training activity is that the primary care clinicians do not have basic research skills that may enable them to define research questions. And then the third part is the primary care is not valued sufficiently to get funding. Either it comes from academics or it comes from practitioners. This sounds a little bit disappointing, and I think that you are looking like that when you hear my talks. But the answer comes already 3 decades ago. And as I underscored in my previous presentation, the problems that we are encountering when we are starting primary care research today are the same problems that somebody would encounter 3 decades ago. And the same applies here in your case, but also in the PBRN's case, in the practice-based research networks case. So the suggestions are very clear. The protocol is needed to be reasonably simple to perform in standard way in each side. Second, that the data collection shouldn't interrupt the patient care flow in the busy office primary care settings. And the third is that you have to be sure that the sample size you can get is appropriate to answer your research question, and this sample size will be available. And the fourth is that the cost of the study is reasonable. But I think that I want to help you, and already Sabir said some basic ideas for startup studies. And here the same applies for the PBRNs and the same applies for you. Very basic ideas for startup studies is who receives primary care or public health services, what sort of care do they receive, and what is the outcome of care? And I would really encourage you to seek that kind of questions. And then here I cited for you some information that comes from the international literature of what kind of PBRN studies we had in early stages of PBRNs. I would say that such kind of studies could be achievable also by someone from you. So a basic treatment study like ear infections treatment, trends in prescriptions as example of antihypertensive drugs, estimation of the health costs associated with some health problem, continuing patient monitoring, for example, when happens the adult onset of diabetes, some frequent health problem cases such as headaches, low incidence health problems like carpal syndrome, treatment and control of, as I said, of common morbidity, common health condition, inter-practice comparisons, and comparisons in diagnostic approaches. The PBRNs, now I'm going to focus for a while on PBRNs only. The PBRNs have research capacity which can enable them to use the database they produce usually through registration, continuous registration or electronic health record aggregations, to use the data to produce sampling frames and to conduct descriptive or longitudinal morbidity studies. The PBRNs have capacity to have clinical trials, recruiting and collecting anonymized data, pragmatic trials, that means per practice, retrieval of identified data from previously consented patients, data validity studies, quality improvement studies, health service and health system research, cost-effectiveness studies, inter-practice comparisons, card studies, and surveys. The surveys and the card studies is a type of studies which are easily achievable, and they overcome the problems of having available health information technology tools or not. When I'm thinking about PBRNs, but also when I'm thinking about the research in primary care settings, I am strongly encouraging to think of research that involves quality improvement. That means quality improvement of healthcare. The reason is that the primary care practitioners will be more willing to collaborate with you for a research topic if it involves quality improvement, because they feel that it has a potential for immediate and tangible impact on patient care, which is not so visible when you are going to talk to them about a single research. In the practice-based research networks level, we have the combination of research together with quality improvement activity. And here you see one of the two papers that I would suggest you to go through, where the author says that the combination of research with quality improvement accelerates the translation of research results into practices, and improves, let's say, more effectively the healthcare in the point of care when the implementation of these interventions happens in the context of research. I have suggested these two papers, and the second paper is the novel protocol for practice-based research networks which are conducting card studies. I would like to speak to you a little bit about the card studies, and you can go through this paper if you are interested. The card studies is one of the most traditional type of gathering data without using electronic health records or any other information technology. They are happening after the decision that we are going to have specific research. The practitioner has a small card in his pocket, and when he encounters in his practice a specific case which is investigated, he keeps notices on his card and put it back on his pocket. In this literature part I proposed is something that maybe is interesting for you, Shabir, because it is proposed a novel protocol where you can go through an IRB review for card studies, and once one card study is produced with that protocol, the next card studies follow the same protocol, so you don't need to have many IRB reviews and which are time-consuming and demanding, and etc. And it is something that maybe it would be useful to be considered in the context of Afro primary health care. I am done with the presentation. Thank you very much for your time. And I would like to hear if someone has a specific.
Yes, I don't see any questions offhand. As just a question, I think Bayu has asked about what is meant by card study. I think you've just explained it. So it's essentially the sort of data collection tool sits as a card in your pocket. Essentially, that's what you're saying, Anna. And
yes,
so
yes.
it's easy to pull out and just keep a record. Now, in some ways, I think we are going to have to, as a group, think about what we do to sort of take small steps as a network grows. And there could be some very basic beginnings. I think like describing the participants actually in this, starting with, I think, and then looking at the practices where we at, to sort of first get a sense of the practices, what is meant by a practice. And then from there, I think this card study would definitely be the one way to look at a really very, very simple data collection tool with which is easy to do, low cost, small sample, can easily be done in your practices. And I think that's based on the practice itself. So I think this is stuff that we're going to look at because we want to encourage practice-based studies. That to us is going to be very valuable. Of course, Anna is coming from a global perspective, perhaps a very much more advanced setting where people have got EHRs or even got paper records. Sometimes, and many places in Africa, there is not even paper to record the patient record. So there's no recording of anything. So we've got to look at simple tasks that can even be done. Let's say you are sitting in a clinic and you are seeing a patient, whether it's a nurse or a doctor or a clinical officer. If you're sitting in a clinic or any primary care setting, which is where we've got to define what is primary care, you can pull out, that out and ask a question, which might be simple, which might be three, and you have in that card or sheet something that just has 3 columns. Usually in quality improvement, you want to collect less information. So it's better. So we can just ask simple questions like, have you been screened for TB? Have you had TB symptoms? Have you had TB treatment before? And just get a sense of TB in the population based on a very simple sampling, and just get something like that. So there's ways, and I think we want to go down that road, but we'll have to take some really small steps beginning. And I think what Anna is doing is sharing with us the possibilities, giving us some really sort of robust thinking globally and some basics to get right. So I want to just echo what Anna has just raised, that it's very important that as we as AfroPHC go forward, that we try to ask ourselves the question, relevance should not be to us and our career paths. A lot of the questions that I've seen are very clinical questions. We should ask ourselves, are we being relevant to policymakers? Are we relevant to communities? And so look at the question and consult with the people around you. And as time goes on, I think you can build in that kind of community collaboration, community ownership, stakeholder ownership as well. And maybe even we can gather some of the ideas about whether there's data that resident, that you are collecting. Maybe you have got EHRs, or you've got some paper sort of data that's available that you could review. So like that, I think we're going to have to do a lot of research to understand better where you are and how you are, and then to try and dig out that information in various ways so that we can have multi-country studies. And I think what Anna's just raised about ethics is really quite an important problem. So we do have a challenge. Many of you may be faced with doing a study. If you are doing it in country, that the ethics itself is a big hurdle, both costs as well as time. So we're going to have to be exploring how that can be fast-tracked, how we can go about it. So we'll look at all those questions, I think, as we proceed. But coming back to what Anna's given, some very nice, simple studies that started off. We have to get you to reflect on those in your studies, in your things. So I don't see any questions, no comments other than what we've done. I think people
may
have
I
found
say
very...
something?
Yes, go ahead. There's
before?
somebody before.
I really encourage simple studies and simple questions, as I said before. And I would like to say that practically many PBRNs in the world were established through a survey. And you shouldn't think negatively of the survey, which is, let's say, one of the easiest studies to do, because it's so important somehow to have outcomes of a survey. For example, in Finland, we conducted a survey to see if the chief physicians of all the nationwide survey, if the chief physicians were interested to conduct research in the primary care settings, and they would give their permission to conduct research in their primary care settings because they are the directors. And we had a fantastic outcomes that more than the half, like 60%, they were positive. They participated in the research and they were positive. So it's fantastic.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, you can have surveys which have qualitative content also, because if you have, for example, open-ended questions, then you can have qualitative material, and then it can be a mixed method study very easily. But I would say that the qualitative research, because I have been conducting mainly qualitative research, is more demanding, and it needs really very good review of literature also.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think we can start. I think what an interesting idea you come up with is the idea of policymakers and managers being possibly, a begin point. So, and I think that's what Tamiru raises in a comment. I think he put it directly to me, but my concern is that when we try to standardize data collection tools and methods, we have to consider the context in Africa. You're absolutely right. I think when we're looking at global standard tools, we are going to have that challenge, which is why we need to be very, very wary of validity and reliability in our settings, and looking at construct validity in the global setting. But I think that even when we are trying to standardize within Africa, the context differs, which is why we've got to look at a standardizing survey. And I mean, that's what Anna's just suggesting now, is that do some simple surveys that just get some basics of awareness of who is out there in the network, and what do they have and what do we do and things like that, basic stuff. And I think that's one of the things we are going to do together with Anna, is to look at that kind of studies to get the base right. And we're going to do that with some of the suggestions. I think the idea is for us to just stimulate your thinking along the lines of treating the people around us here as potential in practice-based research networks. So as we're going along, we'll see how quickly we can get those basic stuff up and done. But I think that we want to nurture it so that we do transform into a PBRN. So Biftu, you've got a question. You can I think you can unmute now. I think, yep, go ahead, Biftu. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Maybe this is a very good idea and a novel idea. When we see, it seems in the place where I'm working, academicians and service providers seems as if they are living in the different world. Therefore, this practice-based research network may bring this on board, and it may minimize the knowledge skill gap. The point I would like to say is maybe the researchers now we are going to support a novice and the approach also has to be from simple to advanced one.
Right.
We need to consider them when we are speaking, when we are talking about.
Yeah.
We better make things as simple as possible to make them understand what they want. And we need to expose them first to their issues. Yes, okay, either both or with a single like qualitative or quantitative, not to make it very, very complex.
That's right.
This is what I would like to say. Otherwise, this is excellent. And also, I would like to say, research means idea maturation, idea sharing, points to be commented. Maybe sometimes people should come on board and maybe share their idea on what is said about. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Biftu. I think very important point that Biftu raises is how we progressing, or where are we focusing? I think at the moment we're focusing on, in terms of the mentorship program, on novice researchers. We have found that a lot of people are not novice researchers, but also want to do research. So in some ways, some of the ideas we are coming up with paint possibilities of, you know, how you can progress and start doing some amazing multi-country research that you know, we'd find influencing in stakeholders. So I think that we've had plenty of like food for thought going forward. And we're going to have to refine the participants of the group. In other words, like Biftu has said, where are they in terms of their levels and how we can take it forward. So we'll try and explore that as we go, perhaps in the next round or a little bit later in the year, just see if we can redo that approach. But right now, we're just going to go with the flow of taking this novice bunch and just getting them to work with something. I think that we are going to look at a second set of programs or something around the researcher who wants to be part of this network and has got more skills. So let's look at that as well. But right now, we'd like to encourage all of you who feel you have got skills in supervision, you've got skills in research, to take on the researchers that have come on board. And at least in that process, I think your learning will improve. Because as we're going along, you know, this group work will be very, very valuable. And I think being engaged with that is really important. So I think we are also going to have to consider stretching the time a little bit and starting a little earlier, because 2 hours is turning out to be not enough time to do group work. And I think there are lots of contributions and thoughts, and we do want to get into small groups. So I'm going to just quickly tell you, going next, and I think, sorry, the other point raised by Joan Keegan about approval, ethics approval, I think that is a genuine problem. We're going to have to look at ways to deal with that. I think what Anna brought up as get the stakeholders involved in that process of, you know, being part of this project might help. We also are going to try to look at that problem in the question of the African Population Cohort Consortium. That has now, just to quickly bring that and explain it, we are talking about practice-based research networks. So in other words, those of us who are working with patients, we could collect data from those patients or in the work that we're doing. Whereas population cohorts means that we have actually taken a population of people. We could do it very collaboratively with them as well. We're looking at population to get people to collect data in the community. And this African Population Cohort Consortium, AfroPHC is part of a successful bid to Wellcome Trust. They have basically tasked the group to develop to form the ideas, consult, etc., to form the ideas for that population cohort consortium across Africa, but bringing together many of the current cohorts, some of them doing genomics and epidemiological stuff, etc. And then AfroPHC is becoming part of that to try and explore how these population consortiums actually link more strongly to clinical services, to practice-based research networks. So I think there's a sort of particular bent we're trying to bring to the whole thing, to say, how do you look at not just collecting information randomly, but link that to the practice and link that to the way in which government is implementing policies, so that there is an opportunity. Obviously, it's a very complex area, but in a way, we are going to be bringing that on board and talking about, amongst our groups, people participating, whether there's anybody who feels they can be interested in being part of such a thing and could potentially create such a thing. So the next 18 months, it's just about conceptualizing the process, but the actual award of the population sort of studies will come later. But I think we need to be ready with people interested to say, oh, well, we've got some ideas and we can become part of that mix. So I think it's just promising stuff that I think you just need to be aware of. We'll bring it up somewhere later to give you some feedback, and may use some of the meetings to consult around it, what your thoughts are on how to shape that particular organization. I think let me stop there. I think, and thanks, Anna. I'm going to share, Anna, don't know if you need to leave, but if you do, it's fine. Thank you. But if you can be around, it'll be great. I don't know if there are any questions right now. I just want to quickly remind people that, I had some basic questions, and the basic questions are, there to help you to think through. So you can, if you have groups, when we just break out in groups in a few minutes, we'd like to have, we'll break out in groups for half an hour. We'll come back and we'll just get some feedback. But we won't have more time than that today. I think people may start disappearing. So I want to just quickly share with you and I just need to get some screens up so that we can share properly. We want to just share Google Scholar, and it's not the most, it is very useful in that it picks up a lot of unpublished material, but you can use that to refine the question better, because that's what you need to do in the literature review. So for us, we basically started with talking about, some ideas, and I want to just show you what I do, and in a way help you to then think that through in the group. I hope that we can get to this quickly enough so that we don't waste too much more time. So the questions I had, and it comes from this idea that we had, which was, how do we, define things? What is the question of the AfroPHC network? And for example, I had a question: what is a way to define primary healthcare services in Africa? And that's just a study. Now, in a way, we're going to put out the groups just now. So if you just relax a few minutes, a few seconds, you basically start with saying, well, let's start looking in the literature. And I think all of you are going to be trying to get there. So if those of you who are sitting with that would be able to sit and say, well, what is the definition? And this is an example of a question, but you need to look at the questions that are there. So Google Scholar, if you just go to Google and look for Scholar, you'll find Google Scholar. Now you look at this and it's like, oh my God, what is this? So I actually am really asking a question, definition of PHC services. What I'm really asking, and sometimes we have to look at this literature and see, well, is there a way I can understand how people define, or maybe ask the question, how to define PHC services? And I'm finding myself again with not what I want, because this is a model for integration, application systems thinking, etc. What I'm particularly looking at is, I want to know, and of course, because I'm interested in the area, I'm going to start asking. So if you ask me, a supervisor asks me, well, what do you really want to define? Services or what exactly? Well, I want to get an idea of the structure of the services. And again, it's not giving me enough, same problem. I come across a word, which is the taxonomy, you know, in other words, how do I define structures of services? And again, it's going to come up with problems. Now, PHC is another problem. You've got to actually say primary health care. And in a way, if some of you are working with it, you'll know that when you sort of decide on that, you can put inverted commas to say, make sure that that's the full word you want to get. And I'm still not getting it. I'm not getting any clear idea of a taxonomy. And you've got to be looking at documents, wider documents. And I've looked at many documents across the world, and it's a difficulty to find a way to say, where does primary healthcare end and where does primary healthcare begin in Africa? And it is not such an easy thing to do. You'll find that there is not, in a way, an easy way to do that. And I might have to think that through. So this might be a question where I say, I'm not finding information that I want to do it. And I've got to be careful, because I've got to really look at whether I'm not looking right with the right search term and the right clarity of idea, defined structure. Maybe I want to ask facilities, which facilities are there in the primary health care setting? And I look and I'm seeing, and of course, you don't look at just one page, you've got to look at what it is, and I'm not seeing anything. Go to a lot more. You've got to go through many, and it's not very clear if I look at what I'm going to get. Now, this can lend itself to a qualitative question, because I've got no clear idea of, or no clear data to do what I'm doing. Now, I don't know whether this would be, in fact, we should be getting something that explains it in other parts of the world. So we need to be looking at literature that does do that. Now, sometimes you might not find that if you look at Google Scholar, you sometimes find that there's no published information there. Google Scholar does look at unpublished material, but sometimes just Google itself might give you different ideas. And you might find Google itself tends to talk about it and gives you something to look at. And you're going to have to look at, well, you know, do I understand it better? Looking around, do I understand the literature better in just Google? Of course, knowing that Google is just going to give you ideas, to get evidence that's published, you're going to have to go to Google Scholar and then to other resources. So let's take another question. And this, again, I've got to go looking, and I'm going to have to, my supervisor is going to have to push me exactly what. I'm going to have to find literature, come back to him saying, well, this is what I think, you know, and this is the literature I found. Together, you know, you help refine the question better, but I might land myself with the same problem that, you know what, there isn't the literature enough, and I might still have to go to gather information where there's nothing available, which lend itself much more to qualitative information. Let's take another. I might find, what is the profile of morbidity? And I think that is a question we'd like to do. Let's take a question that that was asked by Anna, which was, what is the profile of drug management of hypertension in primary care? Was that your question, Anna? I think, let's just see if I've got her question. But Anna had a question that was an easy to start one in, I think, examples that she gave. Treatment, trends in prescription of antihypertensive drugs. Let's take that and see what is the trend of antihypertensive drug in primary health care. And we find, well, actually, here's a prescribing indicator that might help us to see something. So there's some systematic analysis knowledge of hypertension management. So there's information. There is something available. So I would have to go digging all these up and understanding what they're actually saying and what do I want to get in this clarity. And if there is stuff that's already been done that answers my question, then I've got to say, well, actually, what do I want to ask now? So I might want to say, is this answering the question or not? And then I might say, well, I might want to get of prescription of antihypertensive drugs in females, if that's not been answered, or in in female, or in patients with HIV vascular risk as well. So I might find myself narrowing the question down. What are the trends? Because that's my question. So you see, you are basically going to focus your question as you start gathering information. You see my question does have some answers and you understand it and you then dig further. Okay, we are try primary healthcare. Yeah, sorry, I should have just clarified this. Primary healthcare, I think we did do that. Primary healthcare. Yeah, let's just start with Google. So those who are going to be so this just have got various supervisors, but not enough submitted their names as researchers. So we'd firstly like to ask you, please, if you are a researcher, hopefully here, and you can actually bring up your question. Researchers, or generally reviewers and supervisors, if you can, get to know people better in this process, in the group work, and see if you'd like to supervise someone. There's no need to do it right away. We can see those who are really serious as researchers, how they can do with this group work. And by the end of July, people will have to come up with their concept documents. And I think I would urge you all, if you're a researcher, I've circulated it, but go to the website, research and AfroPHC research, and look there and you'll find a concept document with matrix. This will slowly help you to get focused. So if you get this worked out by that time, we do want to make sure that everyone will have a researcher to take them through the finalizing of putting the rest of that together by the end of the year. So we're going to break up into groups. You'll now see a breakout room. So I'm going to do it very randomly because we are 5. I'm going to make 5 groups and we will then get it automatically assigned. I do apologize if you're not with your supervisor. So just work with whoever is available and try to talk to your research project. Firstly, please decide on who is your facilitator. I would strongly advise those who are very strong, please offer yourself forward as facilitator. Get someone who can take some notes, or facilitator just get some quick notes. And then in the group, people who are researchers and have questions, please talk to your questions, offer that I've got a question. We don't have very much time, so we'll try and do that, come back by the hour and see, sorry, hang on, 14:34. We can go to 4 o'clock, so I think we are okay. So we can go to 4 o'clock. We have scheduled the time for 4. So let's see if you can work to 4 o'clock for about 40 minutes. And in the next 40 minutes, you can then come back and we can see what your learnings have been and some of the changes that happened. So I think facilitator, if you can just share where you started and where you ended in terms of the refining of the question. And those are in the groups help, in terms of looking at the internet, yourself searching around the questions and seeing whether you can get your ideas much more clear. Okay, so everyone, we will work for 40 minutes. 40 to 45 minutes, and I think over to you. Group work is going to be utterly important, so do enjoy, and I hope that it works. If you're having any challenges, please come back to me. And if you are struggling with a French group, I think please let's look at a separate French group that we can set up. So you are free to go into your groups for now. I think we'll have to look at a French group. If you're struggling and you cannot speak English, then we'll ask a group to form in French. Lovina, anybody who's struggling please just, if you're still with us, please go in, raise your hand and tell us if you're struggling. I think, let me see if we can set up another group. Nope, I think we'll have to just go with this. So if you're struggling, just come back into this group and we can have a conversation here with Anna convening it. So if you want French.
Shabir, I think you don't see me, so I have to talk. I have to leave at 4 o'clock my local time. That means that I have 25 minutes strictly, even 20 minutes.
No problem. Not a problem. You can join a group just to see the conversation and get a feel for it and leave whenever you need. So thank you, Anna, for sharing your time with us. So Alexandra, you'll stick in the main group, and I think if there's a conversation happening, you can interpret for them or just join the group. So I'm just telling people who are needing to speak French to come back into this group, and then they will. Anyone? So let me join the groups, and I will just. Join group 1. Let me just go back into the group and see if I can help. Hi, is everyone here okay? And we're going to have the groups coming back in a few minutes, so we'll get some feedback from the groups. Anyone here who is on the research mentorship program, and we could just talk to it very briefly. Anybody? If you are, we can just allow you to unmute yourself. Anybody? All right. Close the room in a short few seconds.
Hello, Professor Musa.
Yes, hi.
I did not get your question.
Are you? Yeah, the question is, do you have any? Are you part on the mentorship program, the AfroPHC mentorship program?
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right. So let me ask you quickly, Oken, what question did you have? Are you on the program? Do you want to just share quickly what program you had?
What question I had in the breakout room we had,
topic?
Professor Musa.
Yeah, you are on the
question
program,
we had
right?
in the yes, I'm on the program. Yes.
Yeah. So go ahead. What is the question you put onto the group in the form? Sorry, I'm trying to multitask, which is really. I'm trying to find your details. So let's see. Open. There you are. Eric, all right.
Yes, I am Eric.
Number 20. From Mbarara, welcome. So you had this question of barriers and facilitators to cardiopulmonary resuscitation in Health Center 3 in Uganda. Is that your question, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let's use you as a quick runaround for those who are joining us. I think most people are coming together. So I'm going to just quickly do what I was doing with others to say you basically are looking at barriers and facilitators to cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Of course, you've got to ask yourself, the question is, what exactly are you talking about? So tell me, and this is a reasonably sort of specific question because you have basically a clear idea of resuscitation. It's CPR in a health center, and you are looking at a particular level or a health center 3, which is a defined place in Uganda, and you've got Uganda, so you are looking at it, and you're looking at what are the barriers. So clarity, Eric, are you looking at the practice of resuscitation or the knowledge?
Professor, allow me to leave because I have to travel a long distance.
No problem. Anybody who feels the need to leave, we understand. I know that we stretched it longer than we planned, but we just want to make sure that people get the best value here. So I'm just taking one person,
I
remember. Eric, through the process. Yeah, go ahead. And we're going to get feedback just now from everybody else, but I just want to do this as a bit of an example for everybody else. This is Eric. He's he's basically done this. Eric Oken. He's put his questions on the program, and this is fairly clear. So he's specific in terms of what he's looking at a particular level in a particular place, and he's looking at cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and then his concern are the barriers, facilitators. Eric? Do feel free to engage. This is a conversation. Okay, so is that speaking? Or Bayu suggests that you already have got one study that showed up. Let's just say you want to look at not just barriers and facilitators, you want to look at cardiopulmonary practice, resuscitation practice. You might say, well, I want to be much more specific about cardiopulmonary resuscitation, then I can put in some search around that. And I think we're looking at this recommendations, cardiopulmonary, of course, that gets more, but we could do that, no problem. And so you've got various possible studies. You've got, but you want to get, and you want to be more specific about primary care. So we're looking at that, preparedness. There's some stuff here, physician's attitude. Now, do you see, you're going to have to look at some of this, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Eric?
Yes.
To get it clear. Of course,
yeah, I get it.
When we looked at it, if you're looking at the barriers, and sometimes we tend to think it. Now that may still, you may still end up with very much the same research question, but your literature review, which we're going to talk next about in the next time, has to be a synthesized argument, which tends to end off with a particular sort of a research question. Now, if you are having, let's say, you can't have one research question after long research literature review, because whether it is qualitative research where you don't find information, or quantitative research where you find there's tools that you want to develop, or you have like a survey tool or whatever other. Both of the settings, you have to have sections, subheadings within your literature review, which argue for the different elements. So for example, you might say barriers, and you might come across that same thing. You might have to have a section on barriers, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation introduction. What is it? Practice. You might have then to talk about the barriers, and then the question around facilitators. That might lend itself, because you don't find any quantitative tools to assess it, because you could do it quantitatively, isn't it? Would you be able to do it quantitatively? But you don't know that, isn't it?
So I don't know that.
Search for that. So you have to say, okay, if I'm doing this, I'm getting lots of stuff, but I might find myself missing quantitative stuff. Review is often a good way to enhance it, because you find that you get better quality data, quality information that comes through if there's a review somewhere in it. Systematic review is also one of them, and you can actually have systematic approach to looking for systematic, if we're doing systematic reviews, getting your literature review better focused at this point, and look at the question and see if you have information, then look for information, like, for example, in this case, you might say, I want surveys or questionnaires to try and enhance this, which you may find. And this might be around whether people have that or not. So you've got to be thinking carefully, because you can go in two different directions. I look for these such. I'm not real tools for my setting. The language, I'm not sure if my internet is good. I have a power failure, so I'm struggling with them. Sorry, I seem to have fallen off. My internet is a problem. I'm relying on my phone to manage because I've got no power. So as we were talking just now, we were looking for survey questionnaires, and in fact, you may find preparedness here, preparedness for primary care resuscitation. You could find questionnaires. So looking for validated survey questionnaires itself may give you a particular direction. So don't get caught. So keep looking and finding ways. When you're looking at it qualitatively, where you find, I don't have these kind of tools to use, be careful of making up your own tools, because these can be very challenging and you may not get it published very easily. So always look for validated tools in terms of any time you're trying to do it. If you're looking for examination tools as well, always look for validated tools. And you can look for that. Okay. So keep that in mind. Review validated tools, the searching, and then refine the question based on your interview, on your looking at the question. So I think this refining the question, it's going to get better. I hope that in the discussion, too much is really a problem. Many a times you will be having to have a supervisor that tells you that. We're going to have this repeated in the next meeting, that you are going to look at research, literature review more carefully. And then in the group, we hope we can get people who are going to be able to listen to what you're saying and help you to focus it better. It comes with experience, and we'll try to do it in the bigger group if you can share. So we'll do that, but this is just an idea. Now, I just want to stress something very important. Like I just said, now in a qualitative research, your literature review, and we'll come to that next month, but just to remind you, your research questions become your research objectives. And each section of your research literature review has to be ending off with your research question, which needs to be flipped into your research objective. So for example, if you're looking in this case at barriers of CPR in practice in primary care, you're going to have a section on it, ending off with what are the barriers. The question is, I've found nothing in the literature that tells me primary care in Uganda or in Africa. What are the barriers to primary health care resuscitation in Africa or in Uganda? Can end off that your question. What are? That's the question. When you get to your research objective, and this is your research objectives, which may be 2 to 5, you should be flipping that same thing. And depending on the methodology, you probably have a how, a describe, or you might even say, what is the relationship, or what is the, what is the, usually in this kind of situation, it's be described, but you might have relationships potentially with a survey tool that you feel, I can actually start checking relationships between qualification and barriers, whether that's, related. So you can find relationships, but you've got to then express them. But these become much more deeper. At the moment, I would say if you can just simply get to describing, either qualitative or quantitatively, but you have to have the research literature review speaking to your particular issue. Research question must be objective, 3 to 5 of those, and that's what your research literature objectives, questions and objectives become. People are getting too fast about the final aim. The final aim is your objectives and putting them together, and your research title becomes something convenient. It doesn't need to be the same as your research question or your research aim. It can be slightly different. Depends on you. Sometimes in masters, they want it exactly that same. So you can figure that one out later. But it's for research, if you're not clear about your research question linked to your research objective and how you phrase those things, you'll get stuck in your research. Okay, let me stop there and say that, Eric, I hope this is helpful. And
yes,
we'll
yes,
get some
it's very...
feedback from others in a short time. This is a process, so please don't expect it to be completely hot spot on everywhere. So anybody would like to share some of the group experience, you know, and we can then end off in the half hour. Sorry, anybody would like to share anything that they started off with a particular idea and then ended off with a particular clarity in their question? Anybody?
And can I interfere?
Yes, go ahead, Tamiru. Go ahead.
In our group, Pauline raised one research question that says the impact of primary healthcare service in Africa. And on this research question, there was interesting argument among us. So what we agreed at the end of the day, one is if we consider Africa as a single country, it is possible to do the research, qualitative or quantitative. And if the other assumption also, if the definition of primary healthcare is similar among African countries, it could be, the research can be done as an Africa. However, if the definition is different and we look at African countries each by each, this research question will be very wide, so it is impossible to do that. So at the end of the day, we agree on the first idea that I mentioned. If we assume that the definition of primary health care is similar among African countries, as well as we consider Africa as a single country, so the research can be done. That is, over to you.
Well, you know, true. You can ask the question, what is a definition? And you can have it on the premise that, you know, I want to get a common idea amongst people from across the continent. You've got definitions already. And this is, again, you know, you've got to look at the literature and say, well, I do want to get this idea. But the problem is you are asking a question which itself, I think you've raised it, impact of primary health care. The problem is an impact is a very specific outcome. It's saying, what is it changed in particular around mortality outcomes or particular indicators, the words impact. So you've got to be very careful to use that word. And in fact, it's very difficult when you haven't defined primary health care, whether in Africa or in any country. So you were saying, I think, Tamiru, if I got it right, that the idea would be, let's first start off defining primary health care in Africa.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So defining that first, now you can say, well, I can, and it's part of our challenge. How do you define? So you can look around and say, well, how do we actually find tools? And we were looking at that question earlier when I was saying, what is the taxonomy? How do you describe it? What is in primary care and what is not in primary care? I mean, if you look at it, it's a common problem amongst all of us. It's a definitional problem we all have. So you could look around and you may not find that you can describe it across Africa in a very consistent way because there are no tools to do that. And then you might say, well, my question, how would you describe how would you describe primary health care in Africa? Is also a bit of a challenge, because when you ask that question, you can ask yourself, well, actually, what are you going to get answers? Some people might say, well, it's all about prevention. And that's what primary health care is all about. We should be very community oriented, et cetera, et cetera. But is it actually helping you to define primary care? Because primary health care and primary care are not the same term. Primary health care is a philosophy, whereas primary care is the services.
Yeah.
Follow?
Yes.
So you might have to say, well, actually, what I want to do is I want to define not primary health care. I want to define primary health care services, or maybe I want to define primary health care facilities. Services could include facilities. So you could say, well, how do I go about that? How could I do that in a clearer thing? Because you can, even if you do this in an interview, you don't want to, in an interview, you want to have open information, open questions. but you can't have it so open that you don't get any material value out of it. It's not answering what you want. So you've got to be very careful, and then you've got to justify each of the questions, sub-questions that, as I say, is what you've got to break down. So you're going to have to say to myself, well, I want to answer the question, maybe start off by saying, what do you understand as the difference between primary health care and primary care? And what do you understand by primary care facilities or primary care? And then you want to go into questions of, well, what are primary care services? And then specifically, what are primary care facilities? So those might be your sub-questions. And this is going to be part of what we do next in the literature review, and then in the objectives, and then you're going to have to go round and round to try and refine this question so that you are clear, and that you're going to have these sections in your literature review with each of these elements ending with the research question that you flip over to make your objective. And that makes your research very clear. And in fact, the next thing which we'll talk to later, but is important, is that your objectives, the way they stated, your research question, also in your objectives, need to also start reflecting your methodology. But I think we've already said, how you must look at the literature and see which methodology you're going to. And you've got to go back through it and refine it and make sure that it's clear. So Tamiro, hopefully the group has found value in that. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Good. Any other groups that would like to share? Anybody would like to unmute themselves or just raise their hand? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm here. I like to
go
share
ahead, Constantine. Please do share. Please do share.
Yeah, there was one key question that was posed by one of the members. Holly has already signed off. She had to go.
No problem.
But her concern was a question about low uptake of health interventions in Burkina Faso. And then she was
just say it again, Constantine. Low uptake of health interventions.
Interventions.
Okay. So
yeah, which health interventions by community health workers. And then she posed the question whether digital health intervention could help to improve this aspect of low interventions. And that the concern particularly is on malaria, I think, at the end of the day. So the members look at that as fairly very broad questions that needed to be unpacked because the issue of low uptake, and if we are to raise some particular questions, then we could, for instance, ask why is it that there is low uptake of intervention by CHWs in as far as malaria challenge is concerned? So that could be another thing. Then the other aspect is looking at digital health as a tool to improve this uptake. So some of the concerns raised there is that, for instance, what is the reach of mobile phones, for instance, in the community that can be used as the avenue to reach the community. And then, of course, as you notice, we have in our Zoom meeting here, sometimes the network, I actually went off. I don't know what happened with my, it has just come back. Thankfully, somebody was with me here, and I had to go on his hotspot. So it just went off, but now I see it's come back. So that is the kind of thing. So
great.
Another thing is that we needed to have, if there is indeed low uptake, the question is, does she have the data, initial data to show that there is very poor uptake. So if that is the case, then a proposal can be made that can incorporate digital to really work on that. The issue of mobile phones and other internet or internet connections and or network connections in that sense can still be discovered as you go along implementing that. But we thought it was a good thing. More questions could be raised on that. And then members are keen to see if Holly can still come back with the consultation, and then more can be done of that. I think that is what we did in our room.
Good.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm glad that you had good deliberations around it, and I want to just add some comments to it. I think firstly, to anybody out there who wants to do interventional research, I would say unless you really want to test outcomes, it really requires very, very strong experimental conditions, and it's not so easy. So as novice, you can do it in future. This, your first study is the first step in life, in your research life. So don't worry, you'll get there eventually, but start simple. And often at time, simple can be simply doing what Constantine raised is basic data. And many of our settings, we don't have simple data. And that is a good place to start. Simple, valid data. So just, try to look at the simpler, the better, the focus, the better, and then look at this as a journey. So just to caution against that. I think I just did this quick search on the words that I heard coming through, community health worker, community-based malaria interventions, primary care. And this is just the words that you'll end up looking at digital health. Because digital health is part interventional, I would say, let's look at something beyond that and then see, if we're getting anything else still. Oh, well, there's more. So clearly digital health, there's very little done, but there's more about community health worker programs, which is systems support to say, how might that be, done? Now, again, you are going to have to look at the literature to say, well, actually, what is it I want to test or I want to look at? Let's say you want to clarify that. Let's say he has a notion that there is poor performance of community-based malaria intervention. It's why he said, let me try digital. But there's no study that actually says that in Burkina Faso, there is this happening. So the truth is that what he's saying, there's something here that says utilization for malaria treatment results from a study. So you might look and saying, okay, these are potential that could give me some data to start with, and then I might look at then doing an intervention. That's an interesting idea. But this is where you might say, well, I might look at looking at it slightly more differently. My question would be an interventional one. So I'm saying, what is the relationship, or what is my hypothesis is that digital tools can improve the outcomes of community health worker outreach for malaria treatment. So you have to be sure that you have got that. Now, the other caution I'd have, and this is just personally from digital, is that it is really challenging. You must be very, very careful. So just be careful going down that road. So looking at it, I would be cautious to look at other interventions, and then look at other interventions and see whether you can't do something simpler and see if you can see difference. And then, of course, in this question, you might be saying, well, what is it that I'm looking at in terms of the intervention? And it hasn't been clear. So let's take the strip out the digital. What are the malaria interventions? Is malaria intervention based on what? There's got to be more than just a malaria intervention. Is it about primary prevention or treatment? Is it about secondary prevention? How do we think that could be? Because the community of worker program is in fact really could range between them. So you've got to sit and ask yourself, well, I want to look at that very much more clearer and understand the literature. So I might be sitting and saying, well, what's the literature out there on malaria interventions, community health worker programs? And, you know, you're going to have to keep this to grow and look at it. In surveillance, there's utilization for malaria treatment, communities, development assistance. So you have to look at the impact of introducing diagnostics. So you can see already you are getting quite a variety of the different potentials in what you could be asking about malaria interventions. And if you think, well, you know what, given the amount of work that's being done, you might refine it by reviewing, which will give you a little bit more sort of consolidated information, maybe that will show, and that can be very useful to add a review to that. Or you might say, well, let's just see if there's any validated questionnaires, because validated questionnaires might give you some quantitative stuff that you can, and you might find that a way to pursue a much more, so there's something that you could look at more closely. And you might see, well, is there something in this place that I could look at? Doesn't look like it. But you might find there's something, providers' knowledge, but this might be providers being non-community health workers, but you've got to look at it. So you've got to look and say, you know, look at the literature properly and say, well, actually, there's no literature, or there's this idea. And then you break it down into your sub-questions in your literature review, flip the research question into your objective, and then you know where you're going. And in this process, you've already figured out, I seem to be going more towards a, if it's validated questionnaire, you're going to have to break down the questionnaire into those sub-objectives and write it out and make the sort of elements of the questionnaire your sub-objectives and have that then reflected. Or if it is that it is more qualitative, you're going to have that reflecting because it's key ideas you want to explore. You have to put that into your literature review, flip the research question into your objectives, and then in your research methodology, you're going to have to spell out the elements of your research methodology, if it's qualitative, and usually that will become part of your research interview, your interview guide that you'll use, or depending on your approach, you might have open-ended questions in a research questionnaire, in a questionnaire of that nature. Depends. So you can go about it, and that might also change the way you do it, although in this setting, it might be simple, describe without testing. All right. Any other thoughts? Thank you. Ferdinand, you have a question, Ferdinand? Do you want to bring it up? And I don't know if you had any other people who've got some feedback from the group. Anybody would like to add some feedback? I know the group's growing smaller. Anybody else would like to share what they got out of their group discussion? Thanks, Joan. Go for it.
Okay, thank you, Prof. In our group, I brought up a topic which I had not done the objectives,
right? But
it was an eye-opener about, I wanted to look at the attitudes of health workers, right, in affecting retention of our HIV-positive patients in a primary healthcare facility. But now when we discussed it, we saw that when you talk about attitude, you need to really expound more. Why did you choose attitude and not something else? Yeah. And in the chair, through the chair, we talked that I need to review that topic and look at maybe the issues of accessibility of the service. Would it be affecting? Or what are the determinants of poor retention of clients in our primary care facilities? So that's what we conclude. And also, there was also a topic of one of the group members. Again, she was, I think it was in Ghana. She was talking about financing, to look at the financing, the causes of the, is it the stage? I think she quoted a term there, what you'd want to know about financing in health. So again, she was told that when you go specific, why do you want to choose financing? You really need to read more and explain why you're choosing financing specifically. It's something that you can look at other alternatives like community-based financing. So that's what we discussed in the group, and it was an eye-opener. I think we'll need to review the topics again as we look for now the objectives, something that is specific, that will not start now asking you more questions.
Right. Absolutely. I think the value in this group is also that there are people from very many different backgrounds. They don't all think the same. You know, or not all are doctors, not all are nurses, and there are economists and all sorts in the mix here. So this allows you to get very different type of thinking, people to see the differences better and quicker, and it gets you to be sharper in your thinking. So I'm glad that that's coming through and that you're able to think laterally in doing that. So wonderful. Any other, so just one about knowledge attitudes. I think you're right that knowledge attitudes and practices are a common thing that people tend to do. And these are challenging studies, usually there are many, but you should be very careful. If you don't find a validated questionnaire, please do not do this, because this is very challenging. Otherwise, you often struggle to do this very well. So always look for validated questionnaires for anything that you're looking at, especially in knowledge, attitudes, and practices. And they usually go together. So for example, what you picked up as attitudes, knowledge is what they know, attitudes is what they feel, how they relate, practice is what they do. So you've got to be careful about each one of those things. And if, for example, if you're doing a questionnaire, you're going to have elements of knowledge, attitude, and practices. And like I was saying, your literature review has to talk about knowledge, what's known, what's not known, where your gap is, your research question, your attitudes, and what's known. And you've got to look around and not just take one study that you saw nice and just plonk it there. You've got to read around each one of these elements. So just keep it in mind. Don't do the study unless you are going to do it proper. Okay, so good for you in terms of doing that. But there are knowledge, attitude, practices, surveys out there. So what was the one you were looking at, HIV? Joan, what was the question? HIV retention. John?
Yes, retention in care. Retention in HIV care.
Retention treatment care. All right. So here you've got it, and you can see that validated questionnaire, they could be. So you
I'm not getting any feedback.
Hi everyone, sorry, I am basically stuck without power, so I do enjoy and will be able to see you all next month. But I hope that people will focus on their questions and do come back to us next month. All right, better prepared, and we can make good of this. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Professor.
Bye, Prof.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Prof. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everything's upside down. I've got no power.
Thank you, bro. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.